My name is Maria Mills, Sergeant, United States Special Forces. 3 months ago, I woke up in a military hospital with a dislocated shoulder and my face swollen from the impact. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the image burned into my mind. My mother, Alara, standing frozen in the doorway of my own apartment, her eyes vacant as she watched my stepfather, Corbin, choke the life out of me. Before I blacked out, I managed to send a 3-letter text message that saved my life. Before I tell you how my military family answered that SOS, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe home should be a sanctuary, not a war zone. But it didn't start this way. Long before the battlefields overseas, my first paradise was lost in a quiet suburb of Los Angeles. My childhood was a sun-drenched California dream, a perfect bubble I never imagined could burst. We lived in a modest ranch-style house in the San Fernando Valley, where the air always smelled of fresh-cut grass and the vibrant pink bougainvillea that climbed our fence. My father, an aerospace engineer at a plant in Burbank, was a man of quiet precision. His hands, which could sketch complex blueprints with meticulous detail, were the same hands that patiently taught me how to wax my first surfboard. The sweet, coconut scent of the wax forever linked to his memory. His soul belonged to the ocean. Every weekend, he'd load me and my board into his old Ford Ranger. The dashboard was cracked from a lifetime of California sun, and the radio only picked up classic rock stations. But that truck was my chariot to paradise. We'd drive to Santa Monica, where he taught me to read the waves, to feel the pull of the current beneath my feet. "The ocean can be scary, sweetie," he'd always say, his hand on my shoulder as we watched the sets roll in. "But you never turn your back on it. You face every wave, head on." My mother, Alara, was a high school English teacher who saw poetry in everything. While we were in the water, she'd be on the shore, lost in a thick paperback novel. A serene smile on her face. She was our anchor, the calm center of our perfect universe. I was safe. I was loved. I thought that life, that feeling, would last forever. But perfection is as fragile as glass. It shattered on a gray, drizzly Tuesday afternoon. My father was driving home on the 45 freeway when a semi-truck jackknifed in the rain. He was killed instantly. I remember the 2 California Highway Patrol officers standing on our porch, rain dripping from the brims of their hats. Their faces were grim, their voices practiced and sterile as they delivered the words that vaporized our world. My mother didn't just fall, she collapsed, her body folding in on itself as a sound tore from her throat, a raw, guttural scream of such profound disbelief that it still echoes in the darkest corners of my mind. The months that followed were a colorless fog. Our house, once filled with the smells of my dad's coffee and my mom's baking, now reeked of sympathy lilies and the endless casseroles left by well-meaning neighbors. My mother quit her teaching job. Her world shrank to the 4 walls of her bedroom, the curtains permanently drawn. Most days, she wouldn't even get out of bed. At 12 years old, I became a ghost in my own childhood home. I made myself peanut butter sandwiches for dinner over the kitchen sink. I learned how to use the washing machine by reading the faded instruction manual. I learned to walk on tiptoe, terrified of disturbing the suffocating silence. The financial strain was a slow-moving poison. The life insurance wasn't enough. Red-stamped past due notices began to appear in the mail. My mother, on the rare days she emerged from her room, moved with a devastating slowness, selling off pieces of our life. First her jewelry, then my father's collection of vintage tools, just to keep the lights on. I'd watch her, a stranger in my mother's body, and feel a desperate, aching helplessness. 2 years after the accident, when I was 14, Corbin Vance walked into our lives. He was a building contractor a neighbor had recommended to fix our leaking roof. He was a big man, filling the doorway with his broad shoulders, radiating an energy our house hadn't felt in years. He had a confident smile and calloused hands that fixed our roof, then a leaky faucet, then a broken gate, refusing to take a dime for the extra work. He brought life back with him. The sound of his hammer, the smell of sawdust, the rumble of his truck in our driveway. It was all evidence that the world was still turning. He started bringing groceries and telling my mom cheesy jokes until she laughed. A real, genuine laugh that startled me. He took her out to dinner. He helped her refinance the house, sorting through the mountains of paperwork that had overwhelmed her. He looked at her one evening and said, "A beautiful woman like you shouldn't have to carry all this alone." And I saw a light return to my mother's eyes. He felt like our savior. The day they announced their engagement, Corbin gave me a gift. It was in a small velvet-lined box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace. As he fastened it around my neck, he leaned in so close I could feel the warmth of his breath on my ear. His voice was a low, menacing whisper meant only for me. "Your dad is gone," he murmured. "From now on, I take care of your mom. And you, as long as you know your place." A cold dread washed over me, a primal fear that had nothing to do with the cool metal against my skin. It wasn't a promise. It was a threat. A few feet away, my mother watched, her eyes brimming with happy tears, seeing only a man she loved embracing her daughter. She beamed, completely unaware that he had just fastened the first collar around my neck. The night after the wedding was the beginning of the end. I was in my room, my sanctuary, with my dad's old headphones on, trying to find solace in the familiar chords of Tom Petty. The door was suddenly thrown open with a violent bang. Corbin stood there, his large frame silhouetted against the hallway light, his face a mask of fury. He strode in and ripped the headphones from my head. They clattered to the floor. "In this house, we don't live like separate individuals," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "We are a family. Doors stay open unless you're sleeping. You understand?" My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked past him, my eyes desperately searching for my mother, who hovered in the hallway. "Help me. Say something. Please." But she didn't meet my gaze. She just stared at the worn patch of carpet by my door, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold. Her silence was his victory. Her silence was my surrender. In that moment, watching her choose fear over me, I knew. The rules had changed. My home wasn't my home anymore. It was his. The years following Corbin's arrival were a slow, suffocating descent. He never laid a hand on me, not then. He didn't have to. The prison he built wasn't made of steel bars. It was constructed from fear, shame, and my mother's silent compliance. My bedroom door remained permanently ajar, a constant reminder that I had no privacy, no sanctuary. The house grew quiet, the air thick with unspoken rules and the tension of my mother's fear. Life became a performance. On Sundays, Corbin would fire up the grill for a BBQ, inviting the neighbors. He'd stand there, tongs in one hand, a Coors Light in the other, the perfect picture of the all-American family man. I remember him draping an arm around my mother's shoulders and saying to our neighbor, "I'm a lucky man to have her. She'd be nothing without me." Everyone laughed, thinking it was a joke. But I saw the flicker of pain in my mother's eyes. We both knew it was a statement of ownership. When I was 17, a small crack of light appeared. I won a district-wide literary award for an essay about my father and the ocean. My English teacher, Mrs. Albright, hugged me, telling me I had a real gift. I clutched the certificate, the crisp paper feeling like a passport to a different life, and ran home, desperate to share the good news with my mom. I found her in the kitchen with Corbin, who was sitting at the table nursing a beer. "Mom, look," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. She turned, a genuine smile gracing her lips, but it vanished when Corbin looked up. "Let me see that," he said, his voice flat. I reluctantly handed him the certificate. He scanned it, his eyes lingering on my essay's title, a muscle twitching in his jaw. A slow, contemptuous smirk spread across his face. "Literature? What are you going to do with this? Write greeting cards for a living?" He tossed it onto the counter like trash and looked at my mother. "Alara, this is your fault. You keep filling her head with this useless, artsy nonsense." The air went still. This was the moment for her to be my mother, to defend me. I held my breath, my gaze locked on her, pleading. She flinched as if he'd struck her. She wouldn't look at me. "I'm sorry, honey," she whispered to Corbin. Then she turned to me, her expression a mask of strained apology. Maria, just put it away. His words had been cruel, but hers shattered me. He wasn't just insulting me. He was forcing my mother to be his accomplice. He was making her take the last piece of my father I had left and discard it herself. That fall, I got a part-time job as a barista at a coffee shop on Ventura Boulevard. It was my escape plan. For 20 hours a week, I could breathe, laugh with coworkers, and feel the simple dignity of earning my own money. My first paycheck was only $94, but holding it in my hand, I felt like a millionaire. It was a secret seed of freedom. I walked into the house that Friday, my heart soaring, but it plummeted the moment I saw him. Corbin was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. In front of him was a composition notebook. "Give it here," he commanded. My hand trembled as I gave him the check. He endorsed it, then pushed the notebook towards me. "Write it down. Every penny, date, hours, total." He tapped the page. "From now on, this all goes to me. You think the electricity, the water, the food you eat falls from the sky? You live under my roof, you eat my food, you contribute." He turned my hard-earned money, my ticket out, into rent for a prison cell. The final wall of that prison slammed shut on my 18th birthday. My mother, in a small act of rebellion, had spent the day making my favorite dish, a rich, bubbling lasagna. It was her way of saying, "I love you," without speaking the words. As we sat down, Corbin slid a plain manila envelope across the table. It wasn't a birthday card. Inside was a filled-out application for the local community college. He'd already chosen my major, administrative assistant. "This is your future," he announced. "Time to be realistic. You'll go to school, live at home, and get a job to help this family." Tears welled in my eyes. "I want to study journalism," I choked out. "I want to go to a university. Away from here." He slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses jump. "Don't be ungrateful," he roared, his face turning red. "Who do you think you are to make demands? Your mother doesn't even have a job." That night, long after the house had fallen silent, I heard the TV in the living room. It was Oprah's voice. I crept out and saw her on the screen. "Turn your wounds into wisdom," she said. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Wisdom! I slipped into my mother's room. Corbin was snoring. She was sitting by the window, a silhouette against the distant, glittering lights of the valley. "Mom," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Why do you let him do this to us?" For the first time, she didn't offer an excuse. She turned, and I could see the sheen of tears on her face. Her voice was a ragged, broken whisper. "Because I'm scared, Maria. I'm terrified of being alone. I'm terrified I can't provide for you. At least he's here." She reached out and took my hand, her fingers cold and trembling. "You're stronger than me," she said, her eyes finally meeting mine, filled with a terrible, desperate clarity. "Don't you let him break you like he broke me. Go. Save yourself." It wasn't a mother abandoning her child. It was a prisoner begging her cellmate to find a way to escape. And in her desperate plea, she gave me the only permission I ever truly needed. My mother's words that night, "Go, save yourself," became the fuel for a fire I didn't know I had. They were the permission I'd been waiting 6 years to receive. The next morning, I told Corbin I was going to the library to study for finals. Instead, I took 2 city buses across the valley to the Armed Forces recruiting office in Van Nuys, a sterile, unassuming building tucked into a strip mall. The room smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade cleaner. Posters of determined-looking soldiers in pristine uniforms lined the walls, their gazes fixed on some distant horizon. The recruiting sergeant, a man named Sergeant Miller, had a face like carved granite but kind, weary eyes. He listened patiently as I gave him the sanitized version of my story. That I was looking for a challenge, a purpose, a way to become strong. He laid several brochures on his metal desk. Army, Navy, Air Force. Then he pushed one forward. It was for the Special Forces. The cover showed soldiers rappelling from helicopters, navigating dense jungles, their faces grim and focused. The images depicted a brutal, unforgiving world. I didn't feel fear. I felt a profound sense of recognition. This was a hell I could choose. "This path will try to break you, kid," Sergeant Miller said, his voice a low gravel. "I know," I replied, my own voice steady. "But I'm used to being broken." There was one major hurdle. I was still a few months shy of 18. I needed a parent's signature. That piece of paper felt like the final, insurmountable wall. I carried the enlistment packet home in my backpack, its weight feeling heavier than any textbook. That night, I waited until I heard Corbin's F-150 rumble out of the driveway. He was heading to a sports bar with his friends. I found my mom in the living room, quietly reading. My hands trembled as I pulled the papers from my bag and laid them on the coffee table in front of her. She picked them up, her brow furrowed in confusion. She read every word, every line, and with each page she turned, the color drained from her face. When she finished, she looked at me, her eyes a maelstrom of terror and love. It was a horrifying choice I was forcing her to make. My safety in the present versus my chance at a future. "They'll hurt you, Maria," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It hurts more here," I said softly, and the simple truth of those words hung in the air between us. She looked away, out the window and into the dark street, as if searching for an answer out there. She was silent for a full minute that felt like an eternity. Then she picked up the pen from the end table. The blue ink of her signature, Ilara Mills, trembled on the dotted line. It was the bravest thing I had ever seen her do. She couldn't escape the cage herself, but with one shaky stroke of a pen, she had just unlocked the door for me. I decided to tell Corbin the next evening at dinner. I needed to do it on my own terms, to face him not as a child asking for permission, but as a young woman informing him of a decision. As I explained my enlistment, his face cycled through a series of emotions. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally a surge of pure, violent rage. He shot up from his chair, sending it crashing backward onto the linoleum floor. "You think you're what? Some kind of soldier?" he screamed, flecks of spittle flying from his mouth. "You're mine. You live in my house. You breathe my air. You're not going anywhere." He raised his hand, a motion that had always made me instinctively flinch and cower. But not this time. I stood my ground, my feet planted, my gaze unwavering. "You don't own me," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. "And this isn't your house. It was bought and paid for with my father's life insurance money." His eyes blazed with a murderous fire, but my stillness, my refusal to be intimidated, threw him off balance. For the first time, he saw not the scared little girl he could control, but a stranger he didn't recognize. He saw a threat. He knew he had lost. The day I left, the air in the house was as thick and heavy as lead. While I packed a small duffel bag in my room, Corbin sat in the living room, staring at the TV, his presence a sullen, hateful lump in the center of the house. In a final act of petty cruelty, he kicked over a small box of keepsakes I had set by the door. A few old photos, a seashell from Santa Monica. "You're taking nothing from here but your own failure," he spat. I ignored him, but I did retrieve one small, faded photograph from the floor. A picture of my father, young and proud in his Navy dress uniform. I slipped it into my pocket. The will to fight was in my blood. At the door, my mother pulled me into a fierce, desperate hug. She didn't cry, but I could feel her whole body trembling against mine, a silent storm of grief and fear. She pressed a crumpled envelope into my hand. Inside, I later found, was $200 in cash she must have saved, dollar by dollar, over months. "Be strong," she whispered into my ear, her last command to me. As I walked down the driveway toward the Greyhound bus that would take me to the processing station, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I boarded the bus, found a seat by the window, and only then did I allow myself to look. That moment on the bus was the loneliest I've ever felt in my entire life. It was the price of my freedom. If you've ever had to make a heartbreaking choice to save yourself, please hit that like button to show a little support. And in the comments below, just type the words, "You are not alone." so that anyone else feeling that way today can see it. I only looked in the rearview mirror, watching my mother's small figure shrink, still standing there at the edge of the lawn, until she was just a blurry dot against the backdrop of the house I'd once called home. I was finally free, but I had never, ever felt so alone. Special Forces selection and training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was a purpose-built hell on earth. From the moment we stepped off the bus, we were systematically dismantled. The drill sergeants, with voices like gravel grinders, screamed into our faces, pushed our bodies past every conceivable limit of physical and mental endurance. They broke us down day after day in the humid Carolina heat, in the freezing mud, in the dead of night. They wanted to shatter us into a million pieces. But there was a fundamental difference. Corbin broke me to destroy me. They broke me to rebuild me, stronger than before, piece by piece. Every morning at 0400, when the alarm blared and my entire body screamed in protest, when every muscle felt like shredded glass, I would see Corbin's smug, hateful face in my mind. And I'd get up. This pain was different. This pain was my choice. It had a purpose, and most importantly, it had an end date. The hell I'd left behind had neither. During the worst moments of exhaustion, a quote from General Patton I'd read once would echo in my head: "Accept the challenges so that you can feel the exhilaration of victory." This was my challenge. Victory was my escape. For the first few weeks, I felt utterly alone, a California girl adrift in a sea of hardened recruits from all over the country. My primary competitor was a woman named Sloan. She was from a dusty ranch town in West Texas, tough as a $2 steak and just as lean. She spoke in short, clipped sentences and had a stare that could cut through steel. We were rivals, constantly trying to outrun, outshoot, and outlast each other. That all changed during a land navigation exercise deep in the Uwharrie National Forest. We were on a grueling 20-mile ruck march, each carrying 60 pounds of gear. About 12 miles in, my foot slipped on a wet rock and I felt a sickening pop in my ankle. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up my leg. I collapsed, the weight of the pack driving me into the mud. This is it, I thought. I'm done. I expected Sloan, who was right behind me, to just run past. That's what we were trained to do. Focus on the mission, complete the objective. But she stopped. She didn't say a word. She just knelt, pulled a field dressing from her pack, and expertly fashioned a temporary splint around my ankle with 2 sturdy branches. Then she hoisted my pack onto her own shoulders, 120 pounds of dead weight, and looked down at me, her face impassive. "Get up, L.A., she grunted. "We leave no one behind." That night, huddled by a small smoky fire, our uniforms soaked and caked with mud, we shared a cold can of spaghetti. She never mentioned my injury or her sacrifice. We just sat in a comfortable silence, watching the flames. For the first time in 6 years, the crushing weight of loneliness lifted from my shoulders. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was part of a team. I had an ally. Our commanding officer was Captain Eva Rostova, a woman with piercing gray eyes and a reputation for being unbreakable. She rarely smiled and never gave praise. Her approval was a currency more valuable than gold, and none of us felt we had earned it. At the end of our training cycle, during our final one-on-one evaluations, I sat across from her in her Spartan office, my back ramrod straight. She stared at my file for a long moment, then looked directly at me, her gaze so intense it felt like she was x-raying my soul. "Mills," she said, her voice calm and even. "Your file says you came here running from something. Lots of people do. They usually don't last." She leaned forward slightly. "But what I've seen isn't a runner. I've seen a fighter. You don't just survive, Mills. You adapt, you overcome, and you refuse to quit." She closed my file with a soft thud. "Welcome to the team." Her words hit me harder than any physical blow ever had. It wasn't praise, it was an acknowledgement. It was a statement of my value, earned through grit and sweat and pain. It was the validation I had craved my entire life, not from the family who should have given it freely, but from a woman who had seen the warrior I was forged into becoming. It was worth more than any medal. After graduation, I was assigned to a base on the West Coast, close enough to feel the Pacific breeze again, but a world away from the life I'd left behind. I was given a small one-bedroom apartment in the on-base housing complex. It was beige and boring, with government-issue furniture, but it was all mine. The first time I went to the grocery store, I just stood in the middle of the cereal aisle, overwhelmed. I could buy anything I wanted, I could eat whenever I was hungry. There was no one to monitor my choices, no one to demand my receipts, no one to judge me. It was a simple, profound freedom. That night, I built up the courage to call home. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice a hushed, anxious whisper. In the background, I could hear the tinny sound of a TV sitcom, Corbin's show. "Mom, it's me. I'm okay," I said, trying to inject a brightness into my voice that I didn't quite feel. "I graduated. I have my own place now." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, so long I thought she might have hung up. I could hear her quiet, shallow breaths. Then, her voice, thick with unshed tears, came through the receiver. "I'm so glad, baby," she whispered, before quickly adding, "I have to go." The line went dead. I stood there in my empty, quiet apartment, the silence buzzing in my ears. I knew she was proud. I knew she was relieved. But she couldn't say it. She was still a prisoner. And her warden was in the next room. For a while, my new life fell into a rhythm that felt blessedly normal. There was the satisfying exhaustion of physical training, the intense focus of my work, and the easy camaraderie of weekend beers with Sloan and the rest of our unit. I was building a life brick by brick, a fortress of discipline and purpose. But the calls home were a constant, unsettling echo from the world I had escaped. They were never long. My mother always spoke in short, clipped sentences, her voice tight with a tension that traveled across the phone lines. Whenever I asked if she was okay, the answer was always the same rehearsed line, "I'm fine, honey." Then she'd quickly change the subject. But I could always hear him in the background, a ghost at the feast, a casual, controlling comment like, "Who's that, Alara?" Or an impatient, "Get off the phone, it's costing money." He was still there, an invisible warden monitoring her every word. Each time I hung up, a cold knot of guilt would tighten in my stomach. I was free, but I had left my first soldier behind enemy lines. One week, I called and told her about a weekend hiking trip Sloan and I had taken up in the mountains. I described the clear air, the tall pines, the feeling of accomplishment. I wanted to send her a piece of my freedom. She listened, her responses vague and distracted. Then she said something that made the hair on my arms stand up. "That's nice, dear," she murmured. "Over here. Corbin just finished the new fence. It's very tall." The way she said it, not with pride, but with a flat, hollow resignation, told me everything. He wasn't just fixing the property, he was reinforcing the walls of her prison. That Christmas, a card arrived in a familiar, shaky cursive. Inside was a photo of my mother standing in front of a sparsely decorated Christmas tree. She was smiling, but it was a brittle, paper-thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. They looked tired, haunted. And then I saw it. Tucked just beside her temple, almost hidden by her hairline, was a faint, yellowish-purple bruise, clumsily concealed with a thick layer of foundation. The air rushed out of my lungs. My heart hammered against my ribs with a cold, sickening dread. The psychological warfare had escalated to a physical front. He was no longer content with just breaking her spirit, now he was breaking her body. I called her immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The bruise on your face, Mom," I said, my voice low and tight. "In the Christmas picture." There was a long, dead silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, shallow and quick. Then her voice, small and frail, came back. "Oh, that, I just fell on the stairs, honey. You know how clumsy I am." The lie was worse than the truth would have been. It was so transparent, so pathetic. It told me she was not only a victim, but was now actively protecting her abuser. The invisible walls around her were no longer just his creation. She was now helping to maintain them herself. "I'm coming home," I said, the decision forming and solidifying in an instant. The reaction was immediate and visceral. No! Don't, Maria! Please! She begged, her voice rising in sheer panic. You can't. It will only make things worse. Corbin, he won't like it. Then I heard his voice, a low growl from somewhere behind her. He must have wrenched the phone from her hand. What's she gonna do? He snarled into the receiver, his voice dripping with contempt. Call the cops? Who's gonna believe some runaway kid who joined the army? The line went dead. I sat there in my sterile, quiet apartment, the dead phone still pressed to my ear. The freedom I had fought so hard for, the strength I had built, the new life I had forged, it all felt like a bitter illusion. I was a sergeant in the United States Special Forces, capable of handling threats most people couldn't even imagine. But I was utterly powerless to save my own mother. I was free, but she wasn't. And he was using her to mock me, to remind me that no matter how far I ran, his shadow still reached me. That night, Sloan found me in the on-base gym, punishing a heavy bag with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Sweat and tears streamed down my face as I told her everything. The phone calls, the photograph, the threat. She just listened, her expression unreadable, letting me exhaust my rage and my grief. When I finally slumped against the bag, my knuckles raw and my lungs burning, she put a steady hand on my shoulder. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, Mills, she said, her Texas drawl straightforward and devoid of pity. But you can damn well show them there's a lifeboat waiting. She paused, her grip tightening slightly. And you're not that 18-year-old kid anymore. You're a sergeant. You're trained to walk into hostile situations and neutralize the threat. Think of this as just another mission, a personal one. Her words cut through my despair like a laser. She was right. I had been thinking like a daughter, like a victim. It was time to start thinking like a soldier. I wasn't going back there to plead or to reason. I was going back to extract a friendly who was trapped in a hostile environment. That night, I sat down at my government-issue laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my determined face. I opened a web browser, and with 3 decisive clicks, I booked a one-way ticket to Los Angeles International Airport. The mission was a go. As the taxi pulled up to the curb, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It was the same house, the same faded blue trim, the same overgrown bougainvillea bush I remembered, but it felt alien, shrouded in a gloom that had nothing to do with the overcast sky. I paid the driver and walked up the familiar concrete path, my duffel bag feeling impossibly heavy. On the flight, I had steeled myself for this, repeating a Bible verse my grandmother used to read to me, a line that felt more like a combat mantra than a prayer. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She was so much thinner than I remembered, her bones sharp beneath her thin sweater. Dark, hollowed-out circles shadowed her eyes. She pulled me into a hug, but it was a quick, bird-like embrace, brittle and full of fear. You shouldn't have come, she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the interior of the house. And then he was there, filling the space behind her. Corbin emerged from the living room, wiping his greasy hands on a pair of filthy jeans. He looked me up and down, a slow, deliberate assessment, and a calculating smirk played on his lips. Well, look what the cat dragged in, he said, his voice oozing false cordiality. Looking all soldierly, still just a scared little girl on the inside, though. My eyes scanned the living room wall behind him. A cold fury settled in my chest. Every photograph of my father, smiling at his wedding, holding me as a baby, proudly standing by his first car, was gone. In their place hung a grotesque gallery of Corbin's triumphs. Posed photos of him grinning over the carcasses of deer and wild boar, their dead eyes staring blankly from the wall. He hadn't just moved in. He had systematically erased my father, rewriting our family history with blood and gunpowder. For the next 24 hours, I tried to speak with my mother alone, but he was a constant, suffocating presence. He never left us for a moment, hovering nearby, pretending to fix a squeaky floorboard or watch a game on TV, but I knew he was listening to every word. I waited for a moment when he went to the garage, and I quickly pressed a small folded business card into my mother's hand. It was for a national domestic violence hotline and shelter network. Mom, These people can help, I whispered urgently. They have safe houses, lawyers, everything you need to get out. She stared at the card in her palm as if I'd handed her a live scorpion. Her eyes widened with terror, and she quickly shoved it into her pocket as Corbin's footsteps sounded on the back porch. I don't need that, she lied, her voice a frantic, shaky whisper. Everything is fine, Maria. Everything is fine. The painful truth landed like a punch to the gut. The prison walls weren't just on the outside anymore. He had built them inside her mind, and she had become her own jailer. That evening's dinner was torture. Corbin held court at the head of the table, pontificating about his latest construction jobs, about how hard he worked, about how well he took care of my mother. He was playing the part of the benevolent patriarch, a role so grotesquely false it made me physically ill. I listened, my fork frozen over my plate, my composure held together by years of military discipline. But when he put his hand over my mother's and said, "She's a lucky woman," I finally broke. "So the bruise on Mom's face in the Christmas photo?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet, cutting through his monologue like a razor. "Was that part of the care, too?" The room fell into a dead, ringing silence. My mother's fork clattered onto her plate. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Corbin slowly put his own fork down. The charming smile vanished from his face, peeled back to reveal the snarling monster beneath. "You'd better watch that mouth of yours," he hissed, leaning across the table. "You haven't been here. You don't know what's right and what's wrong anymore. You abandoned her. I'm the one who stayed." The next morning, as I was about to leave for the airport, he cornered me in the entryway. My mother had already retreated to the back of the house, a silent surrender. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said, his voice low and guttural with menace, blocking my path to the door. "Think you can just fly in here, stir up trouble, and fly right out?" He took a step closer, invading my personal space. "It's a small world, little soldier. You can run, but you can't hide. I know where you are. I know where you work. And if I can't have your mother peaceful and quiet, then you'll never have a moment's peace for the rest of your life." It wasn't a threat made in anger. It was a vow. It was a promise of future violence delivered with the cold certainty of a man who believed he was untouchable. If you've ever had that chilling moment where you looked at someone you were supposed to trust and saw a monster looking back, hit the like button. And in the comments, just type one word. I see you. Let's show each other we're not alone in this. As I sat on the plane, climbing high above the sprawling lights of Los Angeles, I didn't feel relief. I felt the cold dread of a soldier who had just walked through a minefield and heard the first click behind her. I hadn't solved a problem. I had just pulled the pin on a grenade, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it exploded. Returning to the structured world of the base felt like surfacing for air, but I couldn't shake the chill of Corbin's final promise. His threat wasn't a memory. It was a ghost that followed me back, haunting the edges of my newfound peace. I tried to bury myself in the familiar routine. Early morning runs, weapons maintenance, tactical briefings, but the armor I had built for myself felt thin and brittle. I became hyper-vigilant. Every white Ford F-150 that passed on the road made my heart leap into my throat. Every unfamiliar noise outside my apartment at night had me instantly awake, my body rigid, listening in the dark. I started checking the deadbolt on my door 3 times before going to bed, a compulsive ritual to ward off a nameless dread. Sloan noticed the change. We were at the shooting range one afternoon when my hands trembled slightly as I reloaded a magazine. "He's in your head, Mills," she said, her voice low and direct, not taking her eyes off her own target. "That's his battlefield. Don't let him win there." I tried to take her advice. I focused on my training, on my duties, on the solid, predictable reality of military life. I looked at my uniform hanging in my closet, the crisp lines, the neatly pressed fabric, the sergeant's stripes on the sleeve. It was a symbol of who I was now, not the helpless girl I used to be. But the fear that was programmed into me as a child was a difficult monster to cage. 2 weeks after my return, the first tremor hit. My phone rang late one night. It was my mother. Her voice was a frantic, broken whisper, words tumbling over each other in a rush of panic. Corbin, he's gone. He left hours ago. He said he had business to take care of. Maria, he took his hunting rifle. The line went dead. I called back immediately, again and again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. I went straight to Captain Rostova and reported the call as a potential threat. She took it seriously, her face grim, but without a direct, explicit threat against me, there was nothing the military police could officially do. "Stay alert, Sergeant," was all she could say, her eyes conveying a warning her words could not. "Keep your head on a swivel." That night, my personal cell rang. The screen read, "Blocked number." My blood ran cold. I hesitated, then answered, my voice a tight whisper. "Hello?" Silence. Complete, dead silence on the other end. But it wasn't empty. Through the static, I could hear it, faintly. A tinny, distant radio playing a familiar country song. It was Garth Brooks' "Friends in Low Places," Corbin's favorite karaoke song, the one he'd drunkenly belt out at every backyard BBQ. A wave of nausea washed over me. He wasn't just coming. He was announcing it. He was enjoying this. The psychological terror continued, a slow, methodical assault. A few mornings later, I found a single cigarette butt on the concrete patio just below my bedroom window. It was a Marlboro Red, crushed out under a heel. His brand. Another day, an anonymous email appeared in my inbox. No subject, no text, just a single, grainy attachment. My hands shook as I opened it. It was a picture of the old treehouse my dad had built for me, the one in the backyard of my childhood home. Scrawled across it in what looked like red spray paint was a crude X. He was here. Not in California, but here, close. Watching me. Playing his sick, twisted game of cat and mouse. The secure walls of the military base suddenly felt like paper. I felt 14 again, trapped in a house with no escape, the monster just down the hall. I reported everything, the call, the cigarette, the email. But he was too clever. There was no direct evidence, no clear line the MPs could follow. It was just a series of unsettling coincidences, plausible deniability. He was winning the battle in my head, just like Sloan had warned. That night, a storm rolled in, the kind that feels like the sky is trying to break itself open. Rain lashed against my windows in violent sheets. Wind howled through the pines outside. I was sitting on my couch, a book open in my lap, but I hadn't turned a page in an hour. My eyes were glued to the front door, to the deadbolt I had checked 3, 4, 5 times. Around 10 o'clock, there was a knock. It wasn't loud or aggressive, it was soft, almost polite. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, my entire body going rigid. Every nerve ending was screaming. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and shaky even to my own ears. No answer. Only the roar of the wind and the drumming of the rain. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the rain-swept, empty walkway illuminated by a flickering porch light. It was just the wind, I told myself. A branch hitting the door. I took a deep, shuddering breath and turned away from the door, my body weak with a strange mixture of relief and adrenaline. And in that exact moment, the world exploded. A deafening crack of splintering wood and metal echoed through the small apartment. The entire door blew inwards, torn from its hinges as if kicked by a mule. And he stood there, framed in the doorway, drenched and wild, the storm raging behind him. His eyes were bloodshot, burning with a pure, unadulterated madness. "I told you!" He roared over the thunder, a terrifying grin spreading across his face. "You can't hide." For a single frozen nanosecond, the 12-year-old girl who had watched her mother collapse in grief screamed in terror. But then, a decade of brutal, relentless training slammed a door on that girl and took command. Fear was instantly vaporized by a tidal wave of pure adrenaline. Conscious thought ceased. The body, honed by thousands of hours of repetition, simply reacted. As Corbin lunged, a wild beast roaring into the sanctuary of my home, I didn't retreat. My feet automatically set into a combat stance. I pivoted on the ball of my left foot, letting his own forward momentum become my greatest weapon. I dropped my center of gravity, got my hips underneath his, and executed a hip throw I'd practiced until it was as natural as breathing. He was a wall of enraged muscle, but physics is a stubborn equalizer. He crashed sideways over the cheap particle board coffee table I'd assembled myself just a month prior. It exploded into a shower of compressed sawdust and splintered laminate, the sound like a gunshot in the small room. But this wasn't a controlled training environment with padded mats and a referee. This was a cramped apartment filled with furniture, and my opponent was a man fueled by a decade of festering hatred. He rose from the wreckage with a guttural roar, a jagged piece of the broken table jutting from his forearm. He barely seemed to notice. He charged again, not like a man, but like a bull. Head down, all brute force, intent on goring me. My small living room became a cage, and the fight devolved from disciplined technique into a desperate, primal struggle for survival. We crashed into the wall, the impact rattling a framed photo of my training graduation to the floor. Glass shattered. I drove my knee hard into the side of his thigh, aiming for the femoral nerve, a strike designed to deaden a leg. He grunted in pain, but his grip on my fatigues only tightened. He used his sheer mass to lift and throw me across the room. I landed hard against the leg of the sofa, the air knocked from my lungs in a painful gasp. He was on me in an instant, his weight crushing. I tasted blood in my mouth. His fists were like cinder blocks, raining down blows that were clumsy but powerful. I raised my arms to shield my face, the impacts jarring my teeth, my skull rattling with each connection. I tried to put him in an armbar, a triangle choke, anything to neutralize his strength, but he was too strong, his rage giving him a terrifying, inhuman power. He landed a clean punch to the side of my head, and the world flashed a brilliant, painful white. Another blow caught my shoulder at a bad angle, and I felt a searing, sickening pop as it dislocated, my left arm going numb and useless beneath me. My vision started to blur, the edges turning a fuzzy gray. And then, through the haze of pain and disorientation, I saw her. Over Corbin's heaving, sweat-soaked shoulder, framed in the ruined doorway against the raging storm, was a silhouette. My mother. He must have forced her to drive the 2,000 miles with him, a terrified hostage on his quest for revenge. She was just standing there, her face a blank, emotionless mask, her eyes as empty and dead as a porcelain doll's. She didn't scream for help. She didn't move to intervene. She didn't do anything. She just watched as her daughter was being beaten to death on the floor of her apartment. That sight, her vacant stillness, hurt more than any of his punches. It was the final, ultimate betrayal, a wound deeper than any fist could inflict. "You're just like your father," Corbin bellowed, his voice hoarse, his face a contorted mask of fury. "Stubborn and useless." His words, meant to be the final nail in my coffin, instead struck a spark. They ignited the last ember of defiance in my soul. I wasn't just fighting for my own life anymore. I was fighting for my father, for his memory, for his honor that this man had spent years trying to erase. With a final desperate surge of strength, I bucked and twisted, but it was useless. My body was failing. He was too heavy, too anchored. He grabbed a thick handful of my hair and brutally slammed my head against the hardwood floor. Stars exploded behind my eyes. The world tilted sideways. He shifted his weight, pinning my arms with his knees, and then his huge, calloused hands, the same hands that had once pretended to fix our home, closed around my throat. "You took everything from me," he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath a foul, hot wave of whiskey and rage. The pressure mounted, a crushing band of iron. My airway slammed shut. My lungs burned, screaming for oxygen that wasn't there. Black spots danced in my vision, growing larger, merging, consuming the world. I felt myself sinking, drowning in a cold, dark, silent ocean. This was it. This was the end. He had won. He was finally extinguishing me, just as he had extinguished my mother's spirit all those years ago. My body started to go limp, the last of my fight draining away. But then, a single thought pierced the suffocating darkness. A voice. Not his. Not mine. It was Sloane's. We leave no one behind. My team. My real family. Rostova's face, stern and proud. Sloane's, loyal and fierce. The faces of the men who had become my brothers. They were my reason. They were my anchor in the storm. With a final convulsive twitch of pure will, my one good arm, my right arm, flailed weakly on the floor beside me. My fingers brushed against something cool, smooth, and hard. My phone. It must have been knocked from my pocket. My vision was almost gone, a tiny pinprick of light in a universe of black. I couldn't see the screen. I couldn't think. There was only muscle memory, drilled into me from years of operating equipment in the dark. The instinctive upward swipe to unlock. The familiar tap where the messaging app icon should be. Tapping the top of the screen where Sloane's name always was in my recent contacts. My thumb, clumsy and numb, hovered over the keyboard. 3 letters. 3 desperate, frantic pulses of my thumb against the cold glass. S. O. S. Send. My hand fell away, limp. The last pinprick of light vanished. The cold, dark water closed over my head, and I knew nothing more. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Seconds. Minutes. It felt like an eternity in that dark, silent abyss. The first thing that pierced the darkness wasn't Corbin's voice, but a cacophony of sound. There was shouting, loud, angry, authoritative voices barking orders. The rhythmic, heavy thud of combat boots storming across my floorboards. And beneath it all, the rising and falling wail of sirens growing closer and closer. When my eyes fluttered open, the first thing I saw wasn't the ceiling of my apartment, but the frantic, horrified face of Sloane, leaning over me. Her eyes, usually so stoic and unreadable, were wide with a terror that mirrored my own. Behind her, my ruined apartment was a whirlwind of motion. I saw 2 large military police officers hauling a screaming, struggling Corbin to his feet. They slammed him against the wall, wrenching his arms behind his back, the sharp click of handcuffs echoing in the room. He was no longer a terrifying monster, just a pathetic, flailing middle-aged man, spitting meaningless curses. He was just a bully who had finally met a bigger force. I later learned that when Sloane received my text, 3 stark letters, SOS, she didn't call 911. She didn't call the base MPs. She did something far more effective. She activated the unofficial network, the phone tree that every tight-knit unit has for emergencies. She called our entire team. The first to arrive were the 2 guys from our unit who lived in the same housing complex. They were the ones who kicked the already broken door in and dragged Corbin off me. The next thing I knew, I was in the sterile white world of the base hospital. The sharp, clean smell of antiseptic replacing the stench of fear and whiskey. My shoulder had been put back in place, a dull, throbbing ache radiating through my arm. My face was a swollen, tender mess. When I finally came to full consciousness, the first person I saw was Sloane. She was asleep in a hard plastic visitor's chair pulled right up to my bedside. Her head slumped against her chest, still in her mud-stained fatigues from a field exercise. She hadn't left my side. On the small bedside table, next to a plastic cup of water, was a pink and white cardboard box. Inside was a half-dozen assorted donuts from the 24-hour shop just outside the main gate, the one I loved. That small, simple gesture of care, of knowing, of being there, was a kindness so profound it brought hot tears to my eyes. A few hours later, I had more visitors. Captain Rostova and the base commander, a full-bird colonel named Thorne, walked into my room. Colonel Thorne was an imposing man with a chest full of ribbons and a voice that commanded attention without ever having to be raised. He stood by my bed, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression grim and resolute. "Sergeant Mills," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I have been fully briefed. Let me be perfectly clear. An assault on one of my soldiers, in their home, on my base, is an assault on the United States Army itself." He looked from me to Captain Rostova, then back. "We will not let this stand. This man has made the single biggest mistake of his life." And in that moment, I understood. Corbin had miscalculated, fatally. In his arrogant, hate-filled mind, he had driven 2,000 miles to attack a scared, vulnerable girl. the one he had terrorized for a decade. He never imagined he was actually attacking a sergeant in the Special Forces, a valued member of one of the most fiercely loyal and lethal families on the planet. He hadn't just poked a bear. He had kicked a hornet's nest the size of a city block, and now the entire swarm was descending. They told me what happened to my mother. The MPs had found her in the passenger seat of Corbyn's F-150 in the parking lot. She was catatonic, huddled into a small ball, trembling uncontrollably and unable to speak. A complete psychotic break. The paramedics had taken her to the psychiatric wing of the same hospital. Later that day, a nurse wheeled me down the hall. I saw her through a small reinforced glass window in her door. She looked so small, so fragile, so utterly broken. All the anger I had felt toward her, for her weakness, for her silence, for her standing by and watching, it all just evaporated, replaced by a wave of infinite, heartbreaking pity. She was a casualty of this war too, a prisoner of war who had been on the battlefield far longer than I had. Corbyn hadn't just tried to kill me that night, he had succeeded in destroying what was left of her. A few days later, when the swelling in my face had gone down and I could sit up without the room spinning, a woman in a crisp dress uniform entered my room. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Sergeant Mills, I'm Captain Monroe," she said, her handshake firm and confident. "I'm with the JAG Corps. Colonel Thorne has personally assigned me to your case." She sat down in the chair Sloane had vacated. "We are going to prosecute Corbyn Vance to the fullest extent of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and Civilian Law. He assaulted a service member on a federal installation. The charges will be extensive." She placed a small digital voice recorder on the bedside table. "But to build the strongest possible case, I need you to tell me everything. Start from the very beginning. Don't leave a single detail out." I took a deep, shaky breath and looked at the small black device. For the first time, I wasn't telling my story as a victim whispering in the dark. I was telling it as a witness, as a soldier, as a survivor. And I knew the final battle was just beginning. The military tribunal wasn't what I had imagined. There was no dramatic shouting, no last-minute confessions. There was only the cold, methodical presentation of the truth. With Captain Monroe at my side, a formidable and brilliant legal warrior, I took the stand in my full dress uniform. I looked out at the courtroom, at the jury of stone-faced officers, at Corbyn sitting beside his defense attorney, trying to look like a misunderstood victim. And I told my story. I recounted a decade of hell, not with tears or anger, but with the calm, factual precision of a soldier delivering an after-action report. I detailed the psychological abuse, the financial control, the escalating threats, and the final, violent assault. My testimony was supported by a mountain of evidence the JAG Corps had meticulously compiled: financial records, testimony from my co-workers at the coffee shop, the threatening email, and forensic evidence from my apartment. The most powerful moment came during the cross-examination. Corbyn's lawyer tried to paint me as a troubled, rebellious teenager, an ungrateful stepdaughter who had run away from a loving home. "Isn't it true, Sergeant," he asked, his voice dripping with condescension, "that you had a history of defying Mr. Vance's authority?" Before I could answer, a quiet sound came from the gallery. I glanced over. In the front row, Sloane, Captain Rostova, Colonel Thorne, and a dozen other soldiers from my unit, my family, all rose to their feet in silent, unified protest. They didn't say a word. They just stood there, a formidable wall of decorated uniforms, their collective gaze fixed on the defense attorney. It was a silent, powerful rebuke, a testament of support that spoke louder than any objection. The lawyer faltered, stammered, and quickly concluded his questioning. When it was Corbyn's turn to testify, his lies crumbled under Captain Monroe's relentless questioning. He was no longer a monster, just a small, pathetic man whose carefully constructed facade had been torn away. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict came back: guilty, on all charges. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, interstate stalking. The judge sentenced him to the maximum penalty, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Justice wasn't a fiery act of revenge. It was the cold, quiet click of a prison door locking shut. A few months later, my mother was released from the treatment facility. She was fragile but clear-eyed, the fog of fear finally beginning to lift. We agreed to meet at a small quiet park overlooking the ocean in Palos Verdes, a place my father had loved. We sat on a bench, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, the salty air cool on our faces. For a long time, we just sat in silence. "I'm sorry, Maria," she finally said, her voice quiet but steady, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I was so scared. For so long. I was too scared to be the mother you needed." Tears I didn't know I still had pricked my eyes. I reached over and took her hand. It was thin, but her grip was firm. "I know, Mom," I said, "and I'm sorry I had to leave you." We didn't need to say anything else. In that shared silence, with the sound of the ocean as our witness, we began to slowly, carefully, rebuild the bridge that had been destroyed so long ago. The wounds Corbin inflicted left scars, but as Oprah had once said, you can turn your wounds into wisdom. My pain gave me a new purpose. With the full backing of Colonel Thorne and the Army, I started a pilot program called Operation Safe Harbor. It's a confidential hotline and support network for service members and their families who are silently battling domestic abuse. The military trains us to fight enemies overseas, but sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one sleeping in the bed next to you. I use my story, the signs I missed, the patterns of control, the escalation, to train commanding officers and senior NCOs on how to recognize the subtle red flags of abuse, how to intervene safely, how to get a soldier and their family the help they need before it's too late. The wound Corbin gave me was meant to be a mark of his power. Instead, I transformed that scar into a shield for others. My story, the one you've been listening to, is over. But my journey isn't. Today, I still serve, but my battlefield has expanded. Sometimes on the weekends, my mother and I will drive out to Santa Monica Beach. She'll bring a book, just like she used to. I don't surf anymore, but I sit with her on the sand, feeling the warmth of the California sun on my face. Corbin tried to drown me in his darkness, but he failed. He didn't understand that sometimes it's from the deepest, darkest places that you find the strength to create a dawn of your own making. My legacy won't be the story of how I survived his attack. My legacy will be the people I helped find their own dawn. Thank you for listening to my story. The truth is, there are millions of us, survivors who have walked through the fire and are still healing from the scars. If my journey has resonated with you, you are not alone. This channel is a place for our stories to be heard and our strength to be shared. Please subscribe and join our community. Because every time one of us stands up and speaks our truth, we light the way for someone else who is still lost in the dark. Be the light. I'll see you in the comments.